Welcome to Game Overview. Today we will be talking about Earthworm Jim, a game that I could honestly talk about for hours. There have been so many versions of the same game, each with distinct differences that, honestly, warrant a video on that subject alone. You got the original Sega Genesis version, the Super Nintendo version, the CD Special Edition, the handheld ports, the enhanced remakes on modern consoles and phones. It's insane, almost as insane as the game itself. It's hard to keep the discussion solely on reviewing the game itself because there's just so much to say about the numerous different ports available. So let's try to stay on task as much as possible. Earthworm Jim is a side-scrolling shooter platformer. You are equipped with a gun that, as long as you're aiming in the general direction of the enemy, it will hit. You can use your head as a whip in close-range combat as well as for swinging around, and you can find upgradable one-time use power shots that wipe out enemies in a single blast. You'll start in a junkyard, travel to hell where you fight a snowman, a planet made entirely of water where you travel around on giant hamsters, a laboratory where you fight a giant robot chicken falling down a bottomless pit, and guide a puppy back home or else face a Hulk-like wrath should you fail. A lot of humor was put into Earthworm Jim. These stages each provide their own gimmick and no two level feels the same. Well, not all stages. My only complaint is that between every level you're presented with a flying minigame of sorts where you gotta navigate Jim through an asteroid field, beat Psychro and you move on to the next level, lose the space race and you gotta square off. Overall, the game isn't too difficult. There are only a couple cases where Earthworm Jim feels a little unfair, but for the most part, the game is generous with lives, continues, and offers 3 levels of difficulty to choose from. Getting through this one will take you about an afternoon and not much practice. Gameplay is standard for a 16-bit platformer, nothing too special, but the true value of Earthworm Jim comes in its presentation. This game is wacky and random, and I love it. As a kid, Earthworm Jim was my favorite cartoon, video game, and toy series ever, and it sucked because there wasn't enough of it. Unlike Power Rangers and Ninja Turtles, 2 brands that will most likely never go away, Earthworm Jim had a cartoon that lasted only 2 seasons, a toy line that ran only 1 series, and 4 video games, 2 of which were not that great, but we'll touch more on that in the future. As mentioned earlier, Earthworm Jim was originally released on the Sega Genesis, so naturally the game's soundtrack is optimized for the hardware. This has led to a big debate amongst fans, both Earthworm Jim and console alike. The big question is whether the game sounds better on Super Nintendo or Genesis. SNES was known for producing better sounding music, but in the case of Earthworm Jim, I actually prefer the Genesis soundtrack over the Super Nintendo's. On Super Nintendo, it sounds more muffled, and on Genesis, it sounds more grungy and rock and roll. Not just that, but some sound effects were removed from the Super Nintendo version.
Wham! Yippee! Go! Yippee! Yippee! It's not that big a deal, but it's still something. Regardless of which console you play on, Earthworm Jim's amazing soundtrack is guaranteed to entertain you. Graphics seem better on SNES at first glance. On Genesis, the first stage just has a static sun, whereas on Super Nintendo there is a bit of a perspective effect and the sun hides behind the mountain of tires. But upon closer inspection, the Super Nintendo version is stretched and cropped. Other than a couple neat backgrounds that the Genesis version lacks, the Super Nintendo doesn't offer a better experience in terms of visuals. Just goes to show that better graphics don't always make a better game. And finally, the most unforgivable of them all, the Super Nintendo is missing a whole level. This is the deal breaker for me, and Genesis is always the way to go when it comes to Earthworm Jim. But if we wanted to get technical, Earthworm Jim on PC and Sega CD is by far the best version, featuring CD quality mixes of an already stellar soundtrack, a new level, extended portions of certain levels, and improved visuals. If you just so happen to have a Sega CD laying around and you can get your hands on a copy, this is the ideal way to play Earthworm Jim. In my case, since I don't own a Sega CD, I managed to find a boxed copy of the PC version on eBay for really cheap. What sucks is that the game was designed to run on Windows 95. I'm not a techno computer guy, so I have no idea how to run the game. If I tweak my PC settings just to get it running, I am greeted with the same looping note of whatever song the game is currently on. Muting the music causes my game to crash. Originally, I had downloaded software that allowed my computer to better run 1995 software, but after trying to find and install that software again recently on my latest laptop, I couldn't get the game to run without crashing. So yeah, I guess technically the special edition is the best edition, but that's if you can somehow manage to get the game to run properly on your current PC or happen to own a working Sega CD and a copy of the game. The biggest slap to the face was the Game Boy Advance port. Animations were removed in many cases, the music sounds awful, the screen is so cropped you can barely see what's going on. Avoid this one. And finally, there was an updated edition on modern consoles and phones. I was only able to play the iPhone version, and after that, never felt the need to play the console version. The updated music was nowhere near as good as the special edition, nor did the updated visuals feel necessary. For me, the best and most accessible version of Earthworm Jim is on Sega Genesis. Overall, Earthworm Jim is an iconic figure from the 90s. It's a shame the franchise didn't take off as well as I believed it could have. If you have a Genesis, be sure to add Earthworm Jim to your collection. If all you have is a Super Nintendo, you'd still be getting a pretty solid experience. It's definitely a game that prioritizes laughs over actual gameplay, and it's not a problem. Earthworm Jim feels like you're playing an animated cartoon. It's a work of art and one of my favorite games of all time. I'm Pollo for Heroes of Fandom, signing out.